One time the Americans genuinely might be ahead of us is when it comes to air conditioning.
Like AC in Germany stands for a crime.
So don't let any of these Europeans tell you that they can't install AC. They can install air conditioning, but their ignorance doesn't let them. And so they have more people that die.
It's July, and in Europe, the reality is inescapable. We have a heat problem. And no, I don't just mean that it's summer and everyone's a little stinky and sweaty. Although, well, yeah, they are. But Europe has a structural heat problem, a city planning problem, an architecture problem, and most importantly, a cultural problem. Because if you're an American, especially if you grew up in the Midwest like me, with humid summers, air conditioning is not just a luxury, it's a building feature. It's like plumbing or a pool or that one drawer in your kitchen filled with batteries, expired coupons, and cables no one can identify. But in much of Europe, air conditioning is treated differently. It's often seen as wasteful, ugly, unnecessary, and unhealthy. And to be fair, Europe had a fair amount of reasoning for thinking this way. For decades, most of Europe simply just didn't need air conditioning the way large parts of the United States did. The buildings were designed to hold heat in the winter, energy policy was built around heating, and urban life was built around shade, shutters, stone, and opening the windows at night. But here's the problem. The climate that created that logic is disappearing. Europe is now the fastest warming continent on Earth, warming at roughly twice the global average since the 1980s. And 2024 was the warmest year on record for Europe, and this latest heat dome has been brutal. So today we're going to talk about why Europe resists air conditioning, why that resistance made sense historically, why it's becoming harder to defend, and what Europe actually needs to do if it wants to balance climate responsibility with basic human health and safety. So, let's take a look. For a long time, extreme heat in Europe was treated like an occasional disaster, a freak event or something that happened in southern Europe or during historic heat waves. Basically, something once every couple of decades. The most famous example is the 2003 European heat wave. That summer killed more than 70,000 people across Europe, according to the WHO and later mortality research. At the time, it felt like a warning from the future. The problem is, that future showed up early. In 2022, researchers estimated over 61,000 heat-related deaths in Europe during the summer alone. In 2023, Europe saw an estimated 47,700 heat-related deaths. And in 2024, the estimate rose again, around 62,000 to 62,775 heat-related deaths across Europe, depending on the study and reporting source. That means that the 2003 heat wave is no longer just a historical tragedy. It's starting to look like an early preview. And heat is not evenly distributed. Southern Europe, Southeastern Europe, dense cities, elderly populations, low-income households, poorly insulated top-tier apartments, these are not just hot places. They're risk zones. In 2024, Southeastern Europe experienced its longest heat wave on record, 13 consecutive days, affecting 55% of the region. That same summer, Southeastern Europe had a record-breaking number of days with at least strong heat stress and tropical nights. And tropical nights are especially important because a hot day is dangerous, but a hot night is when your body loses the chance to recover. Because let's be honest, if your house sits at 31 degrees Celsius at midnight, your sleep suffers, your cardiovascular system suffers, and vulnerable people, especially older people, babies, pregnant people, outdoor workers, people with chronic illness, that can tip from discomfort into the danger zone. And that's why heat is such a strange disaster in a way. It doesn't always look dramatic. You know, a flood gives you images. Fire gives you scorched earth to look back on. Storms give you debris to pick up in the aftermath. But heat gives you a closed apartment, a silent bedroom, an elderly person who doesn't want to bother anyone, and a death certificate that may never say climate change. But to understand why Europe is struggling with heat, you have to understand something basic. Europe's built environment wasn't built for the summer, it was almost always strategically designed around winter. And don't get me wrong, that's not criticism, it made complete sense. For most of modern European history, the central challenge was keeping buildings warm. You built thick walls, you installed radiators, you designed homes to retain heat. You worried about heating bills, fuel supply, insulation, and drafts. Even today, heating dominates household energy use in Europe. The European Commission says that space and water heating represented 77.1% of the final energy consumed by EU households in 2024. And that one number explains a lot. Europe's housing policy, energy infrastructure, renovation subsidies, and public psychology have all been shaped by a single question. How do we survive the winter? But now, Europe has to ask a second question. How do we survive the summer? And that is much harder than it sounds, because many European homes were just simply not designed with active cooling in mind. If you live in an apartment with a huge south-facing window, minimal external shading, poor cross ventilation, and no AC, congratulations, you may be living inside a solar oven with an elevator, if you're lucky. But jokes aside, this is where the European heat problem becomes very different from the American one. In the United States, especially after World War II, massive suburban expansion happened alongside the spread of mechanical cooling. American homes, offices, malls, schools, and cars were built around the assumption that indoor temperatures could be controlled. The U.S. Energy Information Administration says that 88% of U.S. households used air conditioning in 2020. But in Europe, household AC ownership is much lower. The European Environmental Agency reported that the household air conditioning equipment rate in Europe did rise from 14% in 2010 to about 20% in 2019, which is great, but that's not a small cultural difference. That's a completely different relationship to indoor climate. In the United States, cooling is infrastructure, but in Europe, cooling is still often treated like an appliance. And increasingly, that distinction matters. Now, the simple version of this video would be for me just to scream at the camera, Europeans, stop being stubborn and just install air conditioning already. That would be a little too easy, and honestly, it misses the entire point. Europe's resistance to air conditioning comes from several overlapping things. First, there, of course, is the historical climate argument. For a long time, many regions like where I live right here in the Black Forest, even though we are the sunniest city in Germany, we still only truly had a few unbearable days per year. So installing a permanent cooling system was frankly unnecessary. Why would someone spend thousands of euros, fight with your landlord, change your building's facade, and pay higher electricity bills for something you only needed for 2 weeks? And second, there is a very strong architectural argument to be had. Many European cities are old, dense, tightly regulated, and visually protected. External AC units can be difficult to install, especially in historic buildings, apartment blocks, or rental housing. In some places, you may need to get permission from not just the building owners, but your neighbors or the local authorities. And reminder, we typically have different construction types here, so ductwork can't just be hidden within the walls like in the United States or in plenum spaces. And third, there is the energy argument. Of course, Europe has spent years telling people to reduce energy consumption, improve efficiency, and decarbonize buildings. So suddenly saying, hey, actually, everyone, install a machine that uses electricity to pump heat into the street feels like an ideological U-turn. And this concern, by the way, is not fake. Air conditioning can increase peak electricity demand, stress the grid, leak high warming refrigerants if badly managed, and make dense streets hotter by dumping waste heat outside. The International Energy Agency says space cooling is now the fastest growing source of energy demand from buildings globally, rising almost 4% per year to 2035 under today's policy settings. However, the flip side of this coin is the truly impressive build out of renewable energy in Europe's hottest places. Take Spain, for example, where capacity has grown nearly tenfold in the past decade. Right now, as you and I speak, a kilowatt hour of Spanish electricity produced just 86 grams of CO2 equivalent. In the United States, in the state of Georgia, that figure was 442. Portugal does just as well, and France better still, thanks to dozens of nuclear reactors. Now, obviously, not all of Europe can congratulate themselves. Poland remains heavily reliant on coal, making its electricity mix just about as bad as the United States. And Germany's rash decision in 2011 to eliminate nuclear power left it dependent on coal and gas, producing 3 times as much CO2 per watt hour as Spain. But my point here is that Europeans who think first world lifestyles are largely to blame for global warming may feel the pangs of carbon guilt about equipping their houses with air conditioning or using it if they have it. But I don't think they need to. Dialing down the temperature for health and safety will not do all that much to melt the glaciers in much of Europe. However, the fourth, and I think the most significant argument, is cost. Air conditioning is not equally available to everyone. It is much easier to say, well, just install your own AC. If you own your home, you have the savings, you have permission, and you can afford those operating costs. A 2026 Joint Research Center report found that in 2023, EU survey data showed that 26% of households were unable to keep their homes comfortably cool during the summer of 2022. And for the lowest income group, that rose to nearly 35%, in part because of the staggering cost of energy per kilowatt hour here. And that's the part of the AC debate that often gets ignored. This is not just about comfort, this is about inequality. Because let's be honest, wealthy people can adapt privately. They can install split units, they can buy heat pumps, they can live in renovated homes, they can leave the city, work remotely, go to the lake, or take a vacation in the mountains. But poorer people get that top floor apartment with bad insulation, a noisy street where they can't keep the windows open at night, and the expensive electricity, and the job that still requires them to show up in person. So when Europe debates air conditioning, it's not really just debating the machine. It's debating who gets to be safe indoors. But Europe's heat problem is not just about the weather, or infrastructure, or inequality. It's also the sweltering reality that climate change remains a political sticking point. Now, don't mistake me. The science is clear. Human-induced climate change is making these heat waves more frequent and extreme as heat domes become more common due to human-caused warming. The problem is that particular message is often lost if your news sources aren't reporting in a fair or balanced manner. That's why I always use our sponsor, Ground News, because it gives me an easy, data-driven, objective way to read the news. On Ground News, every story comes with a quick visual breakdown of political bias, factuality, and the ownership of sources reporting, all backed by ratings from 3 independent news monitoring organizations. And a story I read on Ground News about the recent UN vote to support strong action on climate change and the United States opposition was covered by 125 news sources. And I've been using their new comparison feature to see specific differences in left and right reporting. For this story, a left-leaning outlet covers the adoption of an international climate action plan to limit the global temperature rise to below 1.5 degrees Celsius, phasing out subsidies for fossil fuel exploration, production, and exploitation, and urging those in violation to provide, quote, full reparation for damage. End quote. Meanwhile, a right-leaning outlet praises the United States' decision to join Russia, Iran, and Saudi Arabia in opposing, quote, another useless UN resolution, end quote, diminishing the concern over climate change as nothing more than useless panic. If one side of the political spectrum is ignoring a story, the blind spot feed will let you know so you can make up your own mind about how reliable the reporting is, which is a level of transparency that I very much appreciate when I'm sifting through the data and reports on each subject that I cover right here on my channel. So go head over to ground.news/Ashton to check it out, or click the link down below in the description of this video. You can subscribe through my link to get 40% off the Vantage subscription, which includes unlimited access to all of their amazing features. Plus, when you subscribe, you're not only supporting me, you're also supporting an independent platform trying to make the news more transparent. But heat is often underestimated because it does not feel like a disaster until it becomes personal. But from a health perspective, heat is brutally efficient. It worsens cardiovascular stress, it increases dehydration risk, it can aggravate kidney disease, make your sleep worse, and reduce labor productivity. And unlike a storm, heat doesn't need to completely destroy your house to harm you. It just needs to make your body work too hard for too long. The 2026 Lancet Countdown Europe report found that nearly all monitored European regions, 99.6%, saw increased numbers of heat-attributable deaths between 2015 and 2024, compared with 1991 to 2000. It also found that daily extreme heat warnings increased by 318% between those same periods. And that is a staggering statistic. Not just one country, not just one region, the entirety of the continent. That same Lancet report, by the way, also found that heat exposure among infants and people over 65 increased by 1.17 billion person days, or 254%, when comparing with those same time periods. And that matters because, well, both literally and figuratively, Europe is the old continent. Europe has a large and growing elderly population, and older adults are much, much more vulnerable to heat. They may sweat less effectively, feel thirst less strongly, take medications that affect hydration or blood pressure, live alone, or be less likely to ask for help. And this is where Europe's cultural habits can and do become really risky. The old advice was just, well, close your shutters and open the windows at night, avoid the sun and drink your water. And for sure, to date, that is still good advice. But it is just simply not enough when indoor temperatures stay dangerously high for days and days. Passive cooling works best when nights cool down. But goodness, during this last heat wave, tropical nights practically eliminate that advantage. If the nighttime temperature does not drop enough, the building cannot reset and your apartment becomes an oven. And that is the nightmare scenario for a continent full of buildings designed specifically to retain warmth. That thing that makes European homes so cozy in February can make them dangerous in June, July, and August. So here's the paradox. Air conditioning can save lives during heat waves. Air conditioning can also increase energy demand and emissions if powered by fossil fuels. Both of these things are true. And this is where the online debate that I'm sure is happening in the comment section right now becomes useless because people just want a simple villain. The anti-AC crowd, again, probably feverishly commenting right now, is probably saying something like, air conditioning is wasteful and makes climate change worse. On the other hand, the pro-AC people, equally as incensed, are probably typing, people are dying, please stop moralizing comfort. And the uncomfortable answer is yes. To both of you, yes, inefficient air conditioning powered by fossil fuels can worsen the climate problem. And yes, denying vulnerable people access to cooling during deadly heat waves is morally indefensible. The EU Commission says that there were 57 million room air conditioners in use in the EU 27 in 2020, and that could rise to 104 million by 2030. It also says room air conditioners used about 1.8% of EU electricity. So the question is not whether cooling demand will rise. Of course it will. The question is whether Europe manages that rise intelligently to the demands, or pretends it's not happening until every single summer becomes a panic buying season for portable AC units. And by the way, those portable AC units like this one are often the worst version of the solution. They're noisy, inefficient, awkward, and frequently used in the exact kind of overheated rental apartments where people have no better option. In my opinion, a better strategy would be to combine several layers. First, reduce heat entering the building, something that European buildings are already pretty good at. And of course, that means external shading, shutters, awnings, reflective surfaces, better windows, roof insulation, green roofs, and urban tree cover. And astute governments offering funding to make old houses energy efficient, which can pay for itself. But second, I also think it's important that we incentivize the installation of efficient reversible heat pumps, especially air-to-air systems, which can provide heating in the winter and cooling in the summer. And third, we have to continue to decarbonize energy so that cooling doesn't automatically mean higher emissions. And yeah, this should include accelerating the buildup of battery storage, upgrading the grid, and adding vastly more renewable energy. In this equation, more domestic air conditioning is little more than a rounding error. And guys, please, I know we can be cynical, but give credit where credit is due, because whether you like the Greens or climate-focused politicians at all, the reality is it's precisely because climate-conscious governments have prodded Europe to quit fossil fuels that the continent's energy is becoming less harmful to the planet and less expensive. The war in Iran has driven up fossil fuel prices, but in parts of Europe, notably France and Spain, electricity bills haven't risen as much. And that reflects smart policies. After the war in Ukraine, many Europeans not only throttled their use of Russian gas, but reduced reliance on it in general. And the countries that decarbonized the fastest have reaped the greatest benefits. And listen, those of you who prefer to tough it out in the summer are free to do so. But the goal should be to make cheap, clean air conditioning available to everyone. Because the climate-friendly answer is to not let people overheat in inefficient buildings. The climate-friendly answer is to make cooling efficient, clean, targeted, and fair. But if Europe's heat future has a battlefield, it's the city. Cities are hotter than their surroundings because asphalt, concrete, brick, and rooftops absorb and re-radiate heat. Traffic and, yes, AC units add waste heat. Dense buildings can block airflow, and the places with the least tree cover are often the same places where lower-income residents live. Europe's urban population is already large, and Climate ADAPT notes that more than 74% of Europe's population lives in these areas. So it's important to note that when we talk about European heat, we're primarily talking about urban heat. And this is where Europe actually has some advantages. Because European cities are dense, they often have public transit. They have walkable neighborhoods. They have an older urban form that can be adapted with shade, trees, fountains, courtyards, and cooler public spaces. But they have to move faster. The 2024 European State of the Climate Report found that 51% of European cities had dedicated climate adaptation plans by 2024, up from 26% in 2018. And yeah, sure, that's progress, but it also means that roughly half still did not. And having a plan is not the same thing as having shaded bus stops, cool schools, renovated apartments, protected workers, and elderly people checked on during heat waves. And this is the danger of European bureaucracy. Listen, sometimes Europe is very good at producing a framework for a plan to create a roadmap for a strategy to develop a consultation about a pilot project. But then July arrives. That temperature hits 38 degrees. The older trams, like in Freiburg, have no AC. The kindergarten my kids attend, no AC. And our upstairs bedroom hits 31 degrees at night. So where does this leave us? Europe's heat problem is real. It's already killing people, and it's getting worse and cannot be solved by technology or just a simple lifestyle change. Air conditioning is not the enemy. Inefficient fossil-fueled cooling, that's the enemy. Unequal cooling where wealthy people are safe and poor people sweat through dangerous nights, that's the enemy. But cooling itself? No, cooling is part of climate adaptation. The continent that built some of the world's best public transport, strongest building standards, and most ambitious climate policies should also be capable of designing a cooling strategy that is not just, well, go buy a portable AC and hope the energy grid survives. Europe has to do better than that. But it also might have to admit something first. The old summer is not coming back. And if Europe wants to protect human health in a warming world, staying cool can no longer be treated as an American weakness. It has to be treated as European infrastructure. So let me know what you think down in the comments. Do you think that Europe needs more air conditioning, or would it just make the climate problem worse? And if you live in Europe, how hot does your house actually get this summer? Let me know down in the comments below. And as always, if you enjoyed what you saw today, be sure to hit that thumbs up button. And for more content from Type Ashton, hit that subscribe button. So, I'll see you next time. Tschüss!